When the century started, at another serene setting, Dimitri Tsakouridis asked David Solomon, what is the central question of our times? Having considered his response then, we return to ask of his opinion now. So David Solomon, what is the central question of our days?
What was my response then? And let's see if that still holds some validity, or whether it's worthy of subjecting to some critical analysis or even dismissal. What did I say then?
That the central question of any time is a constant. And that question is answered in the singular.
Now we're going to revisit that question, really, is what I can now see why you asked that.
It was an important question then, and it is an important question now.
You began this discussion with an unfair advantage in that you had researched the past. And a lot has happened in the last 15 years. A person undergoes many things and involves oneself in growing in different ways and understanding. There are some things in that interview that we did nearly 15 years ago that I find myself impressed by. But I think that what is surprising is that whereas I fully expected my thoughts to be exactly the same as they were then, because I don't recall having fundamentally shifted my perception of the universe, on the one hand there are some slight adjustments to make, and on the other hand there are perhaps some more articulate ways of expressing them. Nevertheless, it was a very, very rewarding exercise. And to listen to oneself try to formulate the answer to that question. And 15 years ago, for some reason, we got onto the concept of God. But you were about to say?
When we consider the centrality of the question and the importance of the question, with the wisdom of 15 years lapsing, would we, that is David Solomon and Dimitri Tsakouridis, have formed the question differently, or would we have manipulated the answer?
Yeah, it's funny because we started talking about postmodernism and the loss of centre, which even by the time of that interview was an old concept. And yet we did that with an approach that was fundamentally grounded in the concept of there being a centre.
A centre.
And perhaps there's an assumption in there that we have kind of swallowed without realising, without checking to see whether it was kosher. And that is that is the question of whether in fact there even is such a thing as a central question. That's a very, very constructed idea. But I believe that if not a central question, there's definitely kind of like a conceptual gravitational vortex around which ideas tend to circulate and eventually spin as they fall through the plug hole of the detritus of human conjecture, and that's a bit harsh. No, like they said, so maybe a whirlpool effect, really.
All right.
So amazingly, in my many discussions with young people, and I think because when we did that about 15 years ago, at that time, I had not spoken to anyone under the age of 20,
yes,
except for my own children.
Yes.
I wouldn't have spoken to anyone under the age of 20 for about 20 years. In that time, since then, I've had much more exposure to younger people. And what strikes me is that some of the central questions of the age, as you put that expression, or what we are now calling, the whirlpool around which questions tend to circulate eventually, are very much those that people ask when they're about 14 or 15 years old. They just revisit them later in a more sophisticated form, or more sophisticated forms, but they are effectively very, very similar questions. They're just not asked or answered so naively, and they are based upon deeper and more advanced reflection. But they are effectively the same questions, and that's questions such as,
how do I look?
Is there a God?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
What's it all about? Why am I here? Right? And yet I think what the perspective of exposure to experience, I was about to say the word maturity, but in my case I'm not going to go there.
We should avoid.
But exposure to experience, and particularly other human beings that through whom you can grow in the process of reflection, you realize that you can go one of two ways. You can either become very cynical in your questioning and response on those topics, or you can develop or strive to develop a kind of philosophical optimism, and so that you would say that at the end of the day, the central question of the age is the same central question of any age, and it is a question that at the end of the day, maybe not at 2 in the afternoon, but at the end of the day, is going to be ethical. And you are going to ask yourself, as a generation, you're going to be guided by the ethical question of how can I act, or how can we act in such a way as to benefit the future.
However, could we not ask this question without any reference to a God?
So that is where all great ethical questions will ultimately lead. They will lead to a discussion of, why should I do that? Why should I act in such a way that leaves a better world for the future than the one I found? What is my interest in doing so? And yes, inevitably, you'll be paddling around there in the shallow end of theology, at least, in order to try to come to terms with why you're asking that question and why that question is important. The problem that we have with the notion of the divine is that really all theological notions must ultimately be wrong. I know that's very disappointing, but really, when I say wrong, let me qualify the word wrong, right? And maybe a better word would be insufficient, inadequate. And wrong if they pretend to be anything else. There are certain revealed religions that claim to have a monopoly on what is the truth about the divine, but we have found that in their attempts to propagate the truth, they themselves find it difficult to countenance the paradox that not everybody believes them and not everybody acts in accord with that truth, and yet if that is the divine truth, then they feel that there ought to be a type of inevitability about its dominance in any discourse or culture.
However, and I would assume equally importantly, at least 2 out of those 3 discursive domains declare from the outset that knowing and understanding the divine is impossible.
Yes, but that doesn't stop them from formulating creeds and sets of legislatory programs outside of which one is regarded as being in contravention of divine will. And you might on the one hand say, well, what they're really saying is we don't know a lot, but this is what we do know. But if they were to be truly scientific like that, if they were to have like a scientific method, this is what we don't know, this is what we do know, then in all honesty, they can't sensibly talk about the relationship between what we do know and what we don't know, right? That would be like me saying, yeah, I do know that if I drop this, water will go all over the floor, right? What don't you know? Well, I don't know what would happen if the floor wasn't there. And I don't know what would happen if there was a table about 3 inches from... I mean, anything beyond the obvious, and the obvious is not always obvious. But theology comes along and says, there's so much we don't know, but here's what we do know. You have to do this, and you have to do that, and you have to do this, and you have to believe this, and you have to believe that. But if you don't do that, then you're in contravention of divine will. But then you already said that there's so much of divine will that you don't know and you don't understand. How do you know that I'm in contravention of it and not in accordance with some other aspect of divine will that you don't know? Because this has been revealed to us. So once again, as soon as you're on the subject of theism, you are on the subject of revelation. And then what happens is you need to subject your revelation and your ideas about revelation to the same sorts of rational criteria that you would subject other things to you. Alright?
Yes.
If I told you that I had a brand new Ferrari parked outside here in Salonika, and that you and I, when we finish this discussion, are going to get in the Ferrari, and not only are we going to get in, I'm going to let you drive.
And we can go to Aristotle Square.
Absolutely. Then you would say, well, hold on a moment, and you would open the door, look outside and see if the Ferrari is there or not, and if you couldn't see it, you would say, where is the Ferrari?
Because what I see outside is a Zastava.
Poi in Ferrari that you said you had, right?
Correct.
And that's how you behave in your everyday life, in your everyday rational approach to fact statements put before you. And religion and theism doesn't play by the same rules.
Yes, and then, when I was listening, I was wondering, why is my revelation better than yours?
Why would you have that question?
Because we believe in revelatory references and connection with it.
Oh, you're talking about comparative religion. Why some religions believe that their revelation is superior to others.
Yes.
Yeah, well, there's another thing. Well, if you know what? That is an assessable criteria. The problem is that no one's criteria really stands up to anything, and stands up to the scrutiny of modern rational inquiry. Yes. But it has the potential. I mean, for example, if I said to you that my revelation happened to me today as I was walking down the street, and suddenly I had the revelation. And you can have the revelation too, exactly the same revelation, either, and I tell you how to do it, either walk down that street at that hour, or say this particular phrase because the revelatory being said to me that if you tell others to say this particular phrase, they will have the same, exactly the same revelation you do. And you said, okay, tell me what I need to do, and I tell you exactly what to do, and boom, you have the same revelation. So there is potential, although...
Yes.
You know, there's a very interesting. We were talking yesterday about 16th century utopias. And in Bacon, Francis Bacon, he writes there. He's got a utopia called Ben Salem. And what happened in Ben Salem is that they had a Christian revelation sometime shortly after the resurrection of the founder of Christianity. There was an appearance to them. Amazingly, this is a complete side note, is that Bacon is anticipating by about 300 years the revelation to the Mormons in America. It's very, very interesting. It's very interesting. Maybe Joseph Smith had read New Atlantis, who knows. But what's interesting in there is that they hint already, because there's, the whole of Ben Salem is basically a civilization whose central institution is a university. Uh-huh. In other words, academics will... Yes. It sounds like an awful place.
No.
Right. Anyway, so this
is bad utopia.
Yeah. But they got a lot of scientific tricks. And one of the things they know a lot about is how to project light and do this. So whereas the city was founded, shortly after the city was founded, these guys have this big, massive cross of light that appears in the ocean, and then one of them goes forward and is given a whole thing, and whatever. They have this big revelation of, not of Christ, but of the truth of Christianity. Only elsewhere is it alluded to that, in fact, you know what, the kind of controlling and founding fathers of the society could easily have manipulated that and done it, which is basically a very, very, once again, anticipating a problem that contemporary technological ability is bringing to the theological issues. People don't talk about this, but it's a real problem, right? It's a real problem. If you were to start a revealed religion today, you would have a number of skeptics who would say, well, that's
a hologram.
That's a hologram, or that is doable. You could do that, right?
Yes.
So I don't know how you did it, but I remember Arthur C. Clarke's famous statement that the science of the future is magic to us today, just as our science is magic to previous generations. It's simply beyond.
Yes.
How did you do that? The only category of experience or thought that we can put that into is magic.
Yes.
So when you add to this, when you add the technological cynicism issue, plus you add to the fact that really all of the great big intellectual justifications for the existence of a God as they were understanding it in the Middle Ages were completely destroyed by Kant and Hume and all the others, right? The put of this together is that really it's rendered any rational discourse on the divine, once again, just spinning around in the vortex on its own tail. There we don't have the concepts for it in the realm of rational positing. If you can't prove the existence of God, you can't disprove it. The whole thing is outside our ability to analyze and discuss. But what people forget sometimes is that it's not so easy to do away with the divine, because the divine can exist in experience and in the existential and in the fundamental realm of the human and what we are and who we are. In other words, if we try to explain God or decide for God what God wants or try to work out how we know we're revealed, that is no longer where I think the structure of God is. I mean, what are we talking about, right? I mean, Hitchens and
And the other guy.
no, Dawkins. Hitchens and Dawkins equally destroyed God, right? I mean, forget about it, right? Forget about it. So the divine is not ultimately provable, interpretable, knowable, but it is experientiable. And what we find when we do try and articulate, I think, when we try and articulate concepts of God that can have meaning, and God as a source of meaning, because we spoke about that 15 years ago as the central point of meaning in any particular discourse, and that still holds true. But if we can say anything, that there seems to be a relationship between the divine and, on the one hand, the notion of the good, and on the other, the notion of truth. It doesn't mean that all truth is divine. But it's a bit like, it's a bit like what the ancients said, that really that Plato, that the good is like the sun and the truth is the light.
Yes.
It emanates from the good. And the closer that human beings arrive at the good, the closer they come to the divine. But that doesn't help anyone really until you start to work out what is the good. And when you work out what is the good that can have some form of relationship with what you might call divine, you ultimately arrive at that which is ethically good. Not that which is good because I get pleasure of it, because it feels good, because it's good for me, but because it's good. I know it's good in a universal sense. It's good in a universal sense because it benefits the other.
So there can be absolute goods in that framework.
Well, then there's a danger, because sometimes people and theistic systems forget that the other includes you.
Oh dear.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Otherwise, it would be imperative to give oneself over completely, one's entire life over completely, to serve others. And while that sounds like a very fine thing to do, it can lead to some very strange conclusions. There always must be a part of self that is retained as other. And therefore, we never arrive at the ultimate sacrifice. And Christianity would posit that the ultimate sacrifice was made by the divine on behalf of itself in order to inculcate human beings with the ability to access that particular divine sacrifice. But whether that's valid or not, it's not something that can be replicated or imitated safely by the boys and girls at home.
Yeah.
Similarly with someone who blows themselves up and takes themselves out, or someone who is walking in the zoo and says, the lions look hungry.
I will prove the point.
I will feed them with myself. Right? That's actually a known concept in Buddhism. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong, valid or not valid, but this is where the idea of not realizing that the other is within as well,
Yes.
can lead to absurd conclusions. So we have to recognize that the other is within self, and therefore you can't be completely selfless. And also because you no longer, you can no longer function effectively as a vehicle to transmit the universal. Because the universal good is that which we are trying to, which is our beacon, and the ethical is to do with that which is improving the quality of meaning and the quality of life, perhaps in reverse order, the quality of life and the quality of meaning for others. And when we look at ourselves as an entire generation, well, the past is extinct. When we were listening to the tape, I quoted Plotinus. Remember that Plotinus tells you that the past becomes extinct with every second.
Yes.
It's now. It's gone. And there's no other place to look to help other than the future. Humanity is rushing headlong towards the future at the speed of 3,600 seconds per hour. We are towards the future. And it is the true unknown. There are days where I believe, and I'm not going to talk about this on tape because it will take me into areas that are very, very esoteric. But it is not simply the case that we are heading into the future. The future is coming towards us, greeting us as we head towards it. There's no other, in some ways, sometimes I think that humanity is in fact a product of these two temporal waves meeting at the present moment. That gives rise to consciousness, but there seems to be, and artifacts are arriving at us from the future all the time. I'm not talking about technology, I'm talking also about texts,
yes,
ancient texts, who are still working towards their final form, because their final form and original form is in the future. That is why the further in the past they're at their most dispersed and corrupt, and we are constantly improving those texts towards their original form. It's a very strange idea, I know, but it's very esoteric and let's not go there. But we are moving towards the future. We don't know what the future holds, but the future represents the unknown, and it represents truly other. Which brings us full circle now into the idea that really the central question of any age is that how can we live in a way that benefits other? And that becomes then, how can we benefit the future? And that then becomes the central question of political discourse. That is, whether you're talking about climate change, whether you're talking about economy, whether you're talking about, all political questions are designed to effect the future. And therefore, politics, good politics, or the politics of the good, always carries with it an ethical dimension, and that ethical dimension is always focused on the future. Now, in saying that, sometimes ethical policies can be focused on the past, but really only in order to create a better future. When, for example, governments, say, apologize for things that have happened in the past, they are attempting to correct the past, but they're correcting the past for an ethical reason that is focused upon the future, so that we can transmit the concept of symbol, the concept of reconciliation, the concept of the newly understood reality about how we perceive certain acts towards the benefit of a greater understanding on the part of the future, in the hope that this will create a better world in the future. So everything is done, and really that's where the divine is. The divine sits in the future as much as the divine sits in the past.
At the same time.
Well, of course. Yes, of course. But I need to add something. What does that mean for me? What does that imply for me? How must I now act?
And what will the response be?
Well, amazingly, I think the response to that realization is really silence. I mean, how you act and how you be, and how you are to be in the world, is answered by your actions and by your being. You are the response to that question. The minute it becomes coagulated into words, it becomes part of the great fossilized edifice of dogma. And really, you need to respond with your own being as the answer to the question. Because ritually, it implies nothing. There is no one particular ritual act that you can do that will be satisfactory as an answer to that question without becoming another imperative of theistic religion. But if you strive to embody the universal principles of the good, that is, what can inculcate a better universe in the future, then you are already on the right track regardless of whichever religious creed you happen to be adhering to, bearing in mind that you need to understand the meaning of the word better. Better. Because there are many, many interpretations of the word better. And many historically problematic interpretations of the word better. And so perhaps we can synthesize from the various spheres of discourse to say, without too much fear that we are going to end up regretting it, is to say that better is that which involves less suffering. And that if on the way to acquiring a universe that expresses less suffering, you cause people to suffer, I'll say that again, if on the way to achieving a universe that suffers less, you cause people to suffer, then you know that you are on the wrong path. That is the closest we can come to defining the concept of wrong. The minute you make a calculation of that type, because I'm with Huxley on this, it is not the ends that justify the means. It is the means which determine the ends. How you arrive at a point will determine what that point is. If you arrive at a point through bloodshed, you will create a universe of bloodshed. And everything is solvable with love. What is love? We need to visit that question next time. What is love?